It started the way most horrors do, quietly, with curiosity. The kind that begins as harmless fascination and ends in obsession. The man who found it wasn't searching for evil. He was searching for truth. A local historian, mid-40s, soft-spoken, the kind of man who believed that everything had a record, a date, a place in the archive. He had spent years documenting forgotten corners of rural Kentucky, abandoned mines, ghost towns swallowed by kudzu, family names erased by time. But on a humid afternoon in late September, while sorting through boxes of water-damaged county ledgers, he came across something that didn't belong. It was a leather-bound folder, warped and blackened by mildew, sealed with a wax stamp that had long since melted into the paper. The label read simply, Family Records, Dunn County, 1890 to 1900. Inside, the pages were brittle, edges eaten by silverfish, and the smell of rot was so strong it made his eyes sting. Yet one document, near the middle, was preserved almost perfectly, as if the air itself had refused to touch it. It was a marriage certificate, yellowed but legible. The groom's name, Samuel R. Collier. Age, 74. The bride, Clara May Collier. Age, 16. At first, he thought it was a clerical error. A duplicated surname was common in small towns, cousins married cousins, names repeated across generations. But as he traced the lineage through census records, the lines began to twist and loop until they no longer made sense. The same names reappeared decade after decade, fathers marrying nieces, cousins birthing siblings. And then came the realization, Clara May wasn't just related to Samuel by name. She was his granddaughter. The historian's pulse quickened. It was the kind of find that could redefine local history, maybe even make headlines. But something about it felt wrong. The ink on the certificate was too dark, too fresh compared to the others. The registrar's handwriting wavered as though written under duress. Beside the signatures, faint smudges marked the page, fingerprints, perhaps, or the ghost of a handprint pressed too hard. He looked up from the page, expecting to hear the usual hum of the courthouse's ancient air conditioning, but the building was silent. The longer he stared at that paper, the heavier the air became, like the past was leaning over his shoulder, daring him to turn another page. There were more documents in the folder, birth certificates, death notices, photographs of a family whose eyes seemed too similar. In each one, he felt something watching him back, something patient, waiting for recognition. That night, when he left the archives, he took the folder with him, telling himself it was for safekeeping, unaware that by doing so, he had just unsealed a century-old secret that was never meant to be found. By the time the historian returned to the archives the next morning, the folder felt heavier than paper should. He hadn't slept. The images of those pale, expressionless faces haunted him, their eyes seeming to follow even when he closed his own. He told himself it was only exhaustion, that the unease curling in his chest was a trick of the mind. But as he began tracing Samuel and Clara's descendants through old property deeds, he noticed something that didn't make sense. An entire settlement, once listed on county maps, had vanished. It was called Elder's Hollow, a name that appeared faintly in records between 1885 and 1923, then disappeared completely from every document after. There were notes of marriages, births, and even land transactions tied to the Collier name, but by 1930, it was as if the town had never existed. The coordinates led to a dense stretch of woodland a few miles off an old mining road, unmarked and forgotten. When he brought this up to the county clerk, the man only shrugged. "Ain't nothing out there but trees and bones," he said, half laughing, half afraid. The historian drove out that same afternoon. The road narrowed as he went, the asphalt breaking into gravel, then dissolving into dirt. Cell service faded, and the air thickened with the scent of pine and damp earth. At first, there was nothing unusual, just endless forest, quiet except for the distant hum of cicadas. But after several miles, he began to notice strange details: fence posts swallowed by vines, fragments of stone foundations beneath the undergrowth, a rusted weather vane tangled in the branches above. It wasn't just empty land. Something had been here, and someone had wanted it forgotten. He stopped at what seemed like an old clearing, the ground uneven beneath layers of moss. A small stone marker jutted from the soil, nearly consumed by roots. The engraving was faint, but he could still make out the letters, CMC, 1914. The initials of Clara May Collier. His breath caught in his throat. The marker was too shallow for a proper grave, and the ground around it seemed freshly disturbed, as though something, or someone, had been unearthed recently. As dusk fell, a chill swept through the clearing, and the woods grew unnaturally still. The historian turned to leave, only to realize he had lost the path entirely. Every direction looked the same. The trees pressed closer, shadows twisting into shapes that almost seemed to move. When he finally stumbled back onto the road, mud streaked his clothes, and his hands were shaking. In his pocket, he still carried a piece of broken stone he'd found near the marker, smooth on one side, but on the other, carved with the faint outline of a family crest he didn't recognize. That night, he couldn't shake the feeling that Elders Hollow hadn't vanished from history. It had simply been waiting. The following week, the historian returned to the woods, driven by a compulsion he couldn't explain. It wasn't curiosity anymore, it was hunger, the need to see what history had tried to erase. He told no one where he was going, left no note, no message. The morning mist was still clinging to the trees when he found the clearing again, this time armed with a flashlight, a camera, and a growing sense that he was trespassing somewhere sacred and wrong. Following a faint trail of stones and sunken fence lines, he pushed deeper into the forest until the air grew colder, heavier, as if he'd stepped through a curtain into another time. That's when he saw it. Half hidden by ivy and the collapse of years stood a house, or what was left of one. Its wooden walls leaned inward, roof sagging like a spine bent with age. Windows were shattered, and the front door hung from a single hinge, creaking faintly with every gust of wind. The house seemed to breathe in the silence, the boards expanding and settling with the rhythm of something alive. The historian hesitated on the porch, flashlight trembling in his hand, before stepping inside. The air was thick with the smell of rot and something else, iron, maybe, or old blood. Dust drifted in the beam of his light like falling ash. In the parlor, warped floorboards groaned beneath his feet, and on the far wall hung a series of framed photographs. At first, he thought they were duplicates. Each one showed a family, a man, a woman, and a child, standing in front of the same house he now stood in. But as his light moved closer, his breath caught. Every man bore the same face. The same hollow eyes. The same crooked smile. Even the women shared features too close to coincidence, each generation blending back into the last until the line between ancestor and descendant vanished. On the mantel, beneath a film of dust, rested a small silver comb and a locket containing a curl of white blonde hair. Etched on the locket's back were the same initials he'd seen on the grave marker, CMC. A sudden creak from upstairs broke the silence. The historian froze. Another, heavier thud followed, deliberate, measured, like footsteps on rotting boards. He called out, his voice cracking in the stillness, but no reply came. Just the sound of something dragging across the floor above him, slow, rhythmic, patient. He backed toward the door, but the air seemed to thicken, the light from outside dimming as if the woods themselves were closing in. For a moment, he could swear he saw movement in one of the portraits, a subtle tilt of the head, a flicker in the eyes, and then his flashlight died, plunging the house into absolute dark. When he stumbled out of the house, the historian didn't remember running. He only remembered the cold, the feeling of hands, or something like hands, brushing against his coat as he fled. The forest was darker than before, a moonless void swallowing every sound except his own breath. By the time he found his car, the sky was bleeding into dawn, and his mind was a blur of images he couldn't shake, the portraits, the locket, the sound of footsteps that didn't belong to him. He told himself it was hallucination, fatigue, maybe even carbon monoxide leaking from the old chimney. But deep down, something in him knew better. Some stories don't end when you leave the woods. They follow. For days afterward, he tried to go back to normal. He catalogued his notes, developed the photos from his camera, and attempted to reason with the impossible. Most of the pictures were blank, overexposed, the negatives fogged as if something had burned through them. But one image, taken near the house, had survived. It showed a figure standing at the edge of the tree line, half-shrouded in mist. The face was pale, almost translucent, with eyes too large and too light. The more he stared, the more certain he became that it wasn't just anyone. It was Samuel Collier. The same face from the portraits, the same impossible, ageless stare, only this time, the photograph had been taken less than a week ago. He brought the image to the sheriff, who dismissed it as a trick of light. But that night, while driving home, he saw her, a young woman walking along the roadside where the forest began, barefoot, wearing a dress the color of bone. He slowed the car, rolling down the window, ready to ask if she needed help. She turned her head just slightly, and the sight froze him. Her features were delicate, almost angelic, but beneath the beauty was something unsettling, too symmetrical, too familiar. Her eyes, pale and unblinking, mirrored the same pattern he'd seen in the photographs on the wall. She smiled faintly, as though recognizing him. "You've seen the house," she said softly, her voice neither child nor adult. "Then you already know who I am." Before he could respond, she turned and stepped into the trees, vanishing without a sound. The historian sat there, heart pounding, headlights cutting through empty air. He wanted to convince himself it was imagination, but when he looked in his rearview mirror, the reflection of her face lingered just behind his own, faint and shimmering, not gone, just waiting for him to come back. In the weeks that followed, the historian unraveled quickly. Sleep came in fragments, and when it did, he dreamed of the woods, of branches curling like fingers, of faces in the trees whispering in voices that sounded like his own. The photograph of the girl remained on his desk, though he no longer needed it to see her. She appeared everywhere now, in reflections, in glass, even in the polished surface of his coffee mug. Each time, she seemed closer, her expression shifting from curiosity to something like longing. He began to hear faint music, the mournful hum of a fiddle drifting through the night air, growing louder whenever he tried to ignore it. The melody felt older than the land itself, a tune meant for summoning. Driven by a mix of fear and fascination, he returned to the archives one last time, determined to trace the bloodline to its end. The deeper he dug, the more the records twisted into impossible knots. Birth certificates overlapped, generations collapsed, names repeated with no clear beginning or end. The Collier family wasn't just inbred, it was recursive, folding back into itself in a way that defied nature. Samuel had married his granddaughter, yes, but it hadn't stopped there. Each generation had bound itself tighter, preserving the same features, the same mind, the same curse. And now, somehow, the lineage was still alive. He found the final entry buried in the county birth register, a child born only 22 years ago in the same region. No parents listed, only a surname, Collier. The realization struck like ice. The girl he'd seen by the roadside wasn't a ghost. She was the last of them, the living continuation of a bloodline that refused to die. Every encounter, every vision, had been leading him to her. Or perhaps, leading her to him. That night, the historian awoke to the sound of his front door creaking open. The fiddle tune was no longer distant, it was inside his house, winding through the hall like smoke. He rose, trembling, and followed it to his study. The folder lay open on his desk, pages fluttering though there was no breeze. In the corner of the room stood the girl, her dress the same bone white as before, her eyes reflecting the faint lamplight. "It always comes back," she whispered, stepping closer. "Blood remembers." He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. In her face, he saw his own, not metaphorically, but literally. The same eyes, the same crooked jaw, the same mark beneath the chin. The circle wasn't just complete. It had chosen him.